Hey, welcome to a new lesson. Now it's time to work with the camera and the null objects. But first, let me give you some tips. For example, I already renamed this layer as particles. Try to do the same so that you keep things organized, because otherwise you can get lost when we start adding some new layers. So that's on one side, and the other thing is that we can change the layers colors. Of course, the colors on the timeline, not here, not on the composition, but the layers colors on the timeline, so that we can identify these layers easily. So for example, I want this background to be from a different color than red, so I will go to this part where it says label, and as you can see, it's now on red. It's a red square. You just have to right click on it and it will show you a list of colors. They have a lot of colors, and maybe I want this to be yellow, and you can see how the layer changed the color on the timeline. So that's pretty useful when we have a lot of layers, and maybe we want all the text layers to be on one color so that we can know what layer is the text layer. Or maybe we want this, maybe we have, I don't know, some clouds on the sky, and we will have different layers for each cloud, so we want to group these layers. We can group these layers together, but we can change the color to identify them more easily. So let's change these particles to an aqua, and the text layers, all the text layers will be orange in our composition. So you can set any color that you want. What matters is that you identify the layers more easily. Okay, now, so I have the particles, I have the first text, and I have the background. Now, I'm going to create a camera. We can leave the settings as they come on default. Click OK. And we can leave the name as camera 1 because we won't be adding any more cameras, so camera 1 works for now. And so let's create an orbit null. Remember how to create the orbit null. You have to select the camera and right click, and now on this new menu go to camera and create orbit null. Alright, now the orbit null is this little square. Remember that the idea is that we attach the camera to the orbit null so that we can move the orbit null or the null object instead of moving the camera. This will make it so much easier, because otherwise we would have to go to the camera transform options and move the camera with these settings, and with the orbit null it is so much simpler, because we only have to move the rotation and the position of the orbit null. Alright, right now you can see that the camera is parented to the orbit null. So if we move the orbit null, we will move the camera as well. But now we have to take our text layer and make it 3D. You can see that the orbit null is already 3D. Now grab your text layer and make it 3D. You don't need to make the particles 3D because the particles are already working on 3D. Remember that on the particles we can move the C radius, so that means that the particles will be all over the place on a 3D space. Now you can grab the camera and select your camera tool to take a look at how this looks. You can see that we can rotate on our space, and this is looking really good. And take a look at how the particles look on the 3D. You can see that we have particles here and particles here. That means that we are on a 3D space. If we zoom in or zoom out, we can see the particles. So that's really cool. Let's go back to where we were here, and now it's time to create the first movement. And what I want is to start from this point, from the start, from the right of this text, and then go to this first screen. I mean, we're going to take our orbit null, and the idea is to start from over here and then go to this part like this, and we see our first text. So we need to create an animation for this, and as you know, this is really simple to create an animation. So grab your camera orbit null and open the position, or just go and press the P on your keyboard to open the position settings. And now click on the stopwatch to create a keyframe. Let's zoom in on the timeline because right now it is on each 5 seconds. We need it to be 1 second apart. So half a second later, we need to add a new keyframe. And now let's go back to the first keyframe, and here is we will change the position. We can change the position by dragging these settings for the x-axis or the y-axis. Remember that the y-axis is this one, the green arrow. The x-axis is the red arrow, which is here, but it's hard to see because of the null object. And the z-axis is the blue arrow, which is pointing front to us right now. Remember that you can select the custom view so that you can see how the space is working right now, and here you can see better the z-axis. Let's go again to the active camera. Another way to move it is to simply move the orbit null. But look at this. If we just select the orbit null and move it, we can move it to any point we want. We can move it to the top or to the bottom, to the right, to the left, anywhere. What I want is to move only on the x-axis. So instead of selecting this orbit null like this on the center, I'm going to select here on the red arrow. Notice that when we stand on this point, when we hover over the red arrow, a little X comes in our cursor. Here is a Y, and if you can see, maybe there's a C there. So we will take the X-axis, and you can see that now we're moving only on the X-axis. So this is better because that way we will know that we are right on this axis. Okay, now drag the orbit null up to this point in the composition. So when we hit play, this orbit null comes from this point to this point, like this. Alright, let's see how it looks on full. Great. Now I want this movement to be better because right now it's looking really good, but first it's going too fast, and second it's going really choppy. You can see that he just gets there and that's it. So we need to add first, separate this a little more, get this second keyframe farther away, maybe to the first second. Yeah, this is looking better now. Now I want to turn this keyframe into an easy ease keyframe so that this transition is smoother. Remember that the easy is, what it does is to add some more keyframes here on this point, so that when he gets here, he gets slower. He gets fast and then slowing down to this point. So right click on this keyframe and select the easy ease. Now you can see that the transition is looking way better now. Now I want some blur effect here. I want that when the text comes in, it comes with a little blur effect, a little motion blur, and I want these particles to have motion blur too. So we are not going to do it in the old school way. We're not going to add some motion blur here on the effects, but we're going to add an adjustment layer, and on that adjustment layer we will add the motion blur, because that way everything will have motion blur instead of just one layer and apply it to different layers. So let's create an adjustment layer, and remember that the adjustment layers are layers where we can add any kind of effects and any quantity of effects, and they will be applied to all the layers. They will affect all the layers that are beneath this adjustment layer. So on this effect, on this adjustment layers, we are going to search for an effect called force motion blur. This effect is on time, or you can just search it here on the search bar. So click on force motion blur, and now if we hit play, you can see a little motion blur here, which is really nice. And besides, the particles also have some motion blur, so you can see when we drag this, you can see the motion blur here, and you can see that the particles also have the motion blur. If we remove the adjustment layers, see how it changes. So this way it looks more real because the camera is moving, and now it gives the effect that the camera is moving really fast. Of course, you can play with the samples if you want the effect to be bigger, but remember that the bigger the number is, the longer it will take to render. So keep that in mind. If your computer is not the fastest, I recommend that you set it to a low number because it will look good anyway. Alright, we are set with the first transition. You can see it was really simple. Now from this point we're going to another point here on this space. We're going to use all the axes, the y-axis and the z-axis. The idea is that the camera will travel all across this little universe that we just created. So let's continue to the next lesson to create another transition.